All right, so we made it through the introduction stuff, all the vocab about energy and chemical reactions and catabolic and anabolic and all that good stuff. Now it's time to start digging into the specific chemical reactions that are important in living things. Cellular respiration is the one we're going to start with, and then we'll get to photosynthesis a little bit later. So the process of cellular respiration is breaking down organic molecules to make ATP. So first, before we start, take a minute and look at the picture shown right here. This is an image from your textbook. Describe the energy transformations you see and talk about what's recycled here. Hopefully, when you thought about energy transformations, in addition to just naming them, there are two main ones here, photosynthesis and respiration. You also kind of described photosynthesis transforms light energy into energy that's stored in the bonds of organic molecules. So that's the transformation in photosynthesis. Then cellular respiration takes the energy in those organic molecules and transforms it into ATP. And of course, in both of those processes, some of the extra energy is lost as heat. You'll notice, of course, this diagram is circular. The things that are recycled are the atoms that make up the molecules. Remember, conservation of matter. Matter isn't created or destroyed, it just recycles. So the carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen atoms that are used in both of these processes recycle over and over. But the purpose of these processes is really to convert energy, starting with energy from the sun, which is kind of the source of energy for all living things, to ATP, which is that usable form of energy that powers cellular work. So the energy conversions are the point of this. We've already talked a little bit about the role of ATP yesterday. We're actually going to kind of work our way backwards through this diagram. So we talked about ATP. Now we're going to talk about cellular respiration for the next week or so, and then we'll talk about photosynthesis, kind of the very first step here. Before we go any further into how that process works, we're going to connect cellular respiration with a couple diagrams that should look really familiar to you. So remember what cellular respiration basically is. We're taking organic molecules and breaking them down to make ATP. So thinking about that, this is one of the diagrams we saw yesterday. Which part or which arrow in this diagram would represent cellular respiration? You should actually highlight it or label it on your notes. So cellular respiration, remember, is taking molecules that we get from our food and breaking them down to make ATP, which is our useful form of energy, right? So this arrow right here represents the process of cellular respiration. We're breaking down those food molecules, particularly glucose, but not only glucose. We're breaking down those molecules to make ATP. So this energy, or this arrow right here, represents cellular respiration. It does also, really, if you highlighted this whole side, that's okay. It does produce small molecules that we can use for other things, and some energy is lost as heat. But the important part is this top piece. One more from yesterday, just to make some connections. Where on this diagram would you locate cellular respiration? Again, highlight it, label it on your notes. So cellular respiration takes food molecules or other types of molecules and breaks them down, which is an exergonic reaction that releases energy, and that energy is used to power the creation of ATP. So in this diagram, cellular respiration is kind of this process I just highlighted in blue, breaking things down and using that energy to regenerate ATP. So you could highlight this half of this circle as well if you want to. So that's where cellular respiration is in some of the things that we talked about yesterday. Today is going to be kind of the introduction to the process and the basics of how we get energy out of this breaking down. And we'll get into more of the details next week. So it breaks down molecules to generate ATP. That means it's catabolic because it's breaking things down, and exergonic, it's releasing energy. You've learned about this reaction before. See if you can write the chemical equation. Don't look it up because I'm going to tell you in a minute, but just see if from your brain you can actually write the equation for cellular respiration. Did it look something like this? You might have written the formula for glucose, C6H12O6, right here instead, and that's fine. But you should have had glucose and oxygen as your reactants. And then the products are carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And again, if you specifically wrote ATP here, that's fine because that is the main type of energy that's created through this process. We'll talk in just a minute about why I put organic compounds instead of specifically glucose, but that's the basic equation for cellular respiration. This is the equation for aerobic respiration. That word means with oxygen. So this is what happens when oxygen's available, and it's the most efficient way for living things to produce energy. But there are other catabolic processes that also produce energy, like anaerobic respiration and fermentation. We'll get to those briefly towards the end of this part of the unit, but we're going to mainly focus on the process of aerobic cellular respiration because that is the way that most energy is produced. Now, the reason that I said organic compounds instead of specifically glucose is that your body and other living things can actually use a lot of different types of molecules as sources of energy. You actually can break down fats. You probably knew that one. You can also break down proteins to get some energy. But the reason that when we learn about this, we focus on glucose is that glucose is a sugar, and sugars are the primary source of energy for living things. And also because glucose travels through the entire pathway, which is one of the reasons that it produces a lot of energy. It goes through every step, and every step along the way, energy is released. And you can see the other types of molecules, they enter this pathway at different points. So your body can break down the fatty acid part of fats, but if it does that, that starts kind of halfway through the process here, and then continues down through the last three steps. So different types of molecules enter the path at different places. We'll focus on glucose because that helps you to learn the entire pathway, and it is a major fuel used by animals. It releases a lot of energy. You don't need to memorize this number, but it's something you might see once in a while. The delta G for the full process of cellular respiration of glucose is negative 686 kilocalories per mole. Remember, it's negative because that means the energy is being released. So there's a lot of energy that's made available through the breakdown of glucose. So the energy from cellular respiration powers the regeneration of ATP, like we said at the beginning. This is one of those examples where the breakdown of glucose, that first part, that's exergonic. But building ATP, adding that last phosphate on, that's endergonic. That requires energy. So this is an example of a pair of energy-coupled reactions. We use this exergonic breakdown that releases energy, and we capture that energy in that molecule of ATP and use it to build that molecule. And the ATP can be used to power all different types of cellular work. Things like building molecules, those anabolic processes that we talked about yesterday. Things like transporting vesicles filled with proteins that need to be secreted out of a cell, transporting other things within and across cell membranes. And also mechanical work like movement, changing the shape of a cell so it can divide, changing the shape of muscle cells so that you can stretch and move and lengthen your muscles. All of that work is powered by ATP. So how does breaking down glucose release energy? This goes back to one of the things we said on the first day of this unit. Cellular respiration is a sequence of redox reactions. Remember, the important thing you need to remember is that redox reactions have to do with the transfer of electrons, and electrons carry energy. The other thing it'll be helpful for you to remember is that those electrons are often attached to hydrogen atoms. So when you look at a chemical equation, the hydrogens are kind of what you want to focus on to figure out where the electrons are going. So for cellular respiration, if we kind of follow the hydrogens, we can see that the hydrogens here are being removed. And so you're left with this molecule that's just C and O. It's just carbon and oxygen. So those are giving away the electrons attached with those hydrogens. So they are oxidized. And those hydrogens end up over here attached to the oxygen. So the oxygen is receiving those electrons. Remember, the one that receives electrons is reduced. And so that becomes reduced and turns into oxygen. So that's how you can kind of visualize cellular respiration as a redox reaction. And we're going to continue talking about how electrons move and are transferred throughout this whole process, because that's where the energy is with those electrons that are often attached to hydrogen atoms. So think about this real quick. This is one of our favorite chemical concepts in biology. In biology, what is the most electronegative element? Hopefully, every time you're hearing electronegativity, you're starting to see this in your brain. Oxygen is more electronegative than nitrogen, which is more electronegative than carbon and hydrogen, which are about equal. You remember this? This is something that should be just solidly planted in your brain because it's really important to a lot of biological processes, especially this one. So the most electronegative element that is commonly found in living things is oxygen. Oxygen plays a really, really critical role in the process of cellular respiration. So these redox reactions, as we transfer electrons, they release energy. And this is kind of why. You have this drawn on in your notes, but you'll need to add to it a little bit. So if you have an electron that's up here attached to hydrogen, you don't need to draw this part right now, but if you have an electron that's attached to a hydrogen atom, and that hydrogen atom finds itself near a nitrogen, that electron's not going to want to stay here anymore, right? It is more attracted to nitrogen because it's more electronegative. That electron's going to want to move to nitrogen. And same thing here. If you have an electron here and that nitrogen is anywhere near an oxygen, that electron is really going to want to go hang out by the oxygen. Think of oxygen like a really, really strong magnet that's just attracting those electrons towards it. So oxygen is the most electronegative. And so if we have electrons that are attached to an oxygen and you wanted to pull them off, that would require a lot of energy, right? It'd be like pulling apart really strong magnets. That requires an input of energy. So you have to add energy to electrons to pull them off of oxygen, which means the electrons up here have the most energy. Electrons on a hydrogen atom have the most potential energy because they have the potential to be pulled off by nitrogen or oxygen and kind of fall down this. I refer to this as like the electronegativity hill. As electrons move from hydrogen to nitrogen to oxygen, they're decreasing potential energy, just like you would lose potential energy as you fall down a hill. And that energy is released as those electrons move towards oxygen and become more stable. And you'll see this happening through the process of cellular respiration. We will come back to this diagram, but it's important to remember that as those electrons are transferred towards things that are more electronegative, they release energy and they become more stable. So organic molecules that contain a lot of hydrogen, like C6H12O6, glucose has a lot of hydrogen atoms, they end up making good fuels because they provide a lot of what we can think of as like hilltop electrons that are at the top of the hill, and they have a lot of potential energy. And it's that potential energy that we use as we break down glucose. Those electrons get transferred eventually all the way to oxygen, and they release energy along the way. Like I said, this is a diagram we're going to come back to, but that's kind of the overview, the basic way that redox reactions release energies by transferring electrons to places where they are more stable, attached to atoms that are more electronegative. So even though cellular respiration is an exergonic reaction, it's breaking down molecules and releasing energy, it still doesn't happen instantly because of this activation energy. If you remember EA right here, this is the activation energy. It's kind of that starting energy that's necessary to get a chemical reaction going. An analogy you can think of with this, it's actually kind of a good thing to have this activation energy in this process, because if we released all the energy, in a molecule of glucose, like if you burn sugar, sugar actually burns really well. It releases a lot of energy super fast, but that's not very useful. A good analogy for this that I've heard is if you put a flame to the gas tank of your car, it's going to release a lot of energy real fast, right? Like it's going to explode. That's not going to help your car to drive, right? It releases the energy, but not in a way that's useful. So the way that this works in living things is that we have enzymes that decrease this activation energy in steps. Cellular respiration is a multi-step process. You saw that in one of those first diagrams today. There are lots of steps in there. And the reason that it works better as a series of steps like that is then it releases the energy in a controlled, useful way. Each enzyme catalyzes one breaking of one bond, one chemical reaction along the way. And so it releases the energy in little useful pieces instead of all at once in an explosive way that's not very useful. So we will be talking about enzymes more as we go through here. And you do need to remember the basic functions of enzymes. So I'm leaving you with 2 tasks for today, in addition to the assignments that you're already working on that are up at the top. One task that I would like you to do, there's nothing specific you're going to turn into me, but this is something you will need to understand and remember before we go much farther, is review some of the information we learned about enzymes. If you look at the prior knowledge document for this unit, it has a couple learning targets and some vocab related to enzymes. There's also some activities listed on the screen right here in Mastering Biology in the study area that you can do if you feel like you need a little brush up on enzymes and how they help to catalyze reactions. You can also look back at the lab from first trimester about catalase. You should still have that in your Google Docs in the folder for this class to remember a little bit about what enzymes are and how they work. The other task, which you need to do before Monday, the last page in your packet, the chemical reactions and energy packet we worked on earlier this week, has a picture of mitochondria on the top half. The bottom half's a chloroplast. You don't need to do that one yet. But before Monday, you need to label or color code, it's up to you, the different structures that make up a mitochondria. We will be talking about a lot of that vocabulary on Monday when we go into the details of this process. So you need to do that before then and make sure that you know where those things are. We are starting, chapter 4 is the one about structures in a cell. So that's the one that'll help you most to identify those specific structures. Some of the words do kind of overlap and mean similar things. So you decide the best way to indicate where they are on your diagram. This is not something I'm collecting. It's part of your notes. But like I said, it's going to be important as we start talking about specifically how cellular respiration happens and where in the mitochondria that happens. If you have any questions about any of this as you work on it, feel free to reach out and contact me. Otherwise, have a great weekend, and I will see you on Monday.